Don't know how it is you looked at me and saw the person that I could be, awakening my heart, breaking through the dark. Suddenly your grace, like sunlight burning at midnight, making my life something so beautiful, beautiful. Mercy reaching to save me. All that I need, you are so beautiful, beautiful. Now there's a joy inside I can't contain, but even perfect days can end in rain. I know it's pouring down, I see you through the clouds, shining on my face. Like sunlight burning at midnight, making my life something so beautiful, beautiful. Mercy reaching to save me. All that I need, you are so beautiful, beautiful. I am come undone, but I have just begun, changing by your like sunlight burning at midnight, making my life something so beautiful, beautiful. Mercy reaching to save me. All that I need, you are so beautiful. Like sunlight burning at midnight, making my life something so beautiful, beautiful. Mercy reaching to save me. All that I need, you are so beautiful, beautiful.
The Master's Bucket. There once was a bucket. Now this was an ordinary bucket, as excuse me. This was an extraordinary bucket. The bucket was made of wood and made sure to keep itself as clean as possible. It was also proud of its shiny metal handle. Now the bucket lived out back in the master's tool shed. Usually every day, the master would come and grab the bucket, taking it outside for various purposes. Sometimes the bucket had to endure holding dirt. The occasional worm was always a delight. By day's end, the bucket would usually be filled with water to take back to the master's house. The bucket was always placed back on its shelf to await the next day when the master would return. It always felt faithful that it had fulfilled its calling as a bucket. Now one evening, a terrible storm blew through the land. A loud wind accompanied the rain. The wind was so fierce that it blew through the cracks of the master's tool shed and knocked the bucket right off its shelf. It landed with a crack and was knocked senseless. The bucket woke up the next morning as the master carefully lifted it off the ground. As the bucket was placed back on the shelf, it realized in horror that it had a hole in its side. The master inspected the hole and then quietly left the shed. The bucket was devastated. Who would ever want a bucket with a hole in it? It thought to itself. It sat in the shed for days, waiting for the master to return, possibly with its replacement. The next day, the master came in. The bucket was so afraid of what was going to happen that it closed its eyes. It felt the master lift it up by its handle and carry it outside. The bucket slowly opened its eyes when it felt the master's hand cover up the hole. and then it felt what must have been seed being poured inside of it. The bucket quickly looked at where the hole was. The master's hand kept any of the seed from spilling out. The bucket was once again happy to be used. The master carried the bucket towards the field where the well was. Suddenly, the bucket felt the master's hand move away from its horrible hole. In shock, it felt the seed begin to spill out upon the ground. It tried everything it could to keep the seed in, but to no avail. By the time they had reached the well, the seed was all gone, and the bucket was exhausted from trying to keep it from spilling out. Once again, the master placed his reassuring hand over the bucket's hole. This time, though, the bucket felt cool water splash against its sides as it was filled. The bucket became determined to keep the water in for its master. But as they walked back through the field, the master cracked open his fingers and water began to seep out. The bucket was dismayed as it felt the water slowly disappear. What was the master thinking? There would be no water left by the time they got back to the house. It was that horrible hole's fault. The bucket tried its best to keep in the water, but in the end, it was all gone by the time they reached the master's house. The bucket felt like the biggest failure. Now this routine went on for quite some time, and always, the bucket was unable to keep the seed from spilling and the water from pouring out. After months of enduring this failure, the bucket felt it had to say something. The next morning, the master came in as normal, and when he reached for the bucket pulled back its handle. The bucket looked up at the master and said in a sad voice, "Oh, master, why do you continue to use me? I can no longer do what you need of me. I cannot hold in the seed, and the water you draw is always gone before we reach your home. I feel that I have become a failure as a bucket to you." The master said nothing. Instead, he gently took hold of the bucket and walked outside to the field that they walked every day on the way to the well. The master lifted the bucket up high. The bucket looked upon the field and was amazed. Amazed to see that it was filled with flowers stretching all the way to the well. The bucket was speechless. The master looked at the bucket and said with great love, "Do you now see? It was because of your brokenness that I was able to create such a thing of beauty." The bucket pondered the master's words and realized that its purpose wasn't in just being a bucket, but rather to be faithful to whatever the master intended. The end.